The president has a council of economic advisors, and that council is chaired by Professor Dr. David Ndii. One of the members of that council is Professor Vincent Machuki. He's the advisor on education. He's our guest. Good morning, Prof.
Good morning, Eric.
Welcome to Kenya's biggest conversation.
Thank you very much.
It's good to have the president's men sitting on the hot seat of the Situation Room.
My pleasure.
Especially soon after the radical changes that have been proposed by the president's working party on education reforms.
Sure.
You're here so that we can explain. You can explain to us what exactly is going to happen, how you're going to see our education sector looking in coming years. But to welcome you to the conversation, CT has the day's proverb. This week's proverbs have been from the Republic, the Federal
Republic of Somalia. Yes, and this is our last proverb for the week. From Somalia.
Okay.
The oldest man in the family and a midwife do not tell everything they know.
The oldest man in the family and a midwife do not tell everything they know.
Yes.
Prof, what do you think the Somalis are saying?
I think what they're saying is they want to leave room for self-discovery.
They will not tell you everything.
Yes.
Go find out some things for yourself.
Yes.
Hey, City.
You know, this one, this is the beauty of asking people. The way proverbs resonate with the people, it's so fascinating to hear. Because I could never have thought of it that way. Could never. And yet when you say it, it sounds very clear. So yes.
Yeah.
So it's big.
Thank you.
You need to discover a number of things for yourself.
Yes. Through
experience. And, of course, going through the terrains of life so that you get to know.
Yeah.
You need not to be told everything.
Yeah.
And even in our education system, you have the formal education, you have that which you are born with. So you need not to be told everything. Yes. There's that which you learn.
You learn something.
Yeah, you learn something.
Okay.
Yeah.
Prof, what were you doing before the president picked you as his advisor on education?
Okay. I was a director of the University of Nairobi, Kisumu campus. And I have been director for 6 years. So my term of directorship was ending in September last year. I could not be director of a campus if I was not a member of the university's academic body.
Yeah.
So in the University of Nairobi, that's where I've grown, having been taken in as a tutorial fellow, grown through to be lecturer, senior lecturer, and a professor in a period of 11 years. Yes.
Good stuff. So the president picks you as his education advisor among the other advisors that he has on food security, on economy, on everything else.
Yes.
When the president was akiweka Biblia chini hivi, there was a whole conversation about our education sector. We are changing our curriculum. We have issues with universities that are completely insolvent. We have issues with tertiary education. We have issues with people's ability to actually take their children to school on school fees. And all those things, the first thing that we saw the president do is appoint this working party on education reforms. The report is out. It has very many recommendations, starting with how we take our children to school in the early education program, into the primary years, into the secondary years, which we are no longer going to be calling them secondary, and into tertiary and university education. These are far-reaching reforms.
Sure.
Ndu.
Hmm.
Just some highlights.
A few of those, which Working Party told us about. Firstly, that the Kenya Institute of Curriculum Development will reduce learning subjects. So we're seeing a reduction in those. That was one thing that came out because the load seems to be heavy, right? Sure. So we're looking at a reduction from 9 to 7 in lower primary, upper primary from 12 to 8, junior from 14 to 9, and pre-primary to have 5, and senior school to have 7. Big difference from what we see today. Yes. School capitation is to be increased, and then you will have double capitation to 2,000 for the primary level, 2,000 and some on top, 15,000 for junior school, 22,000 for senior school, right? 19,000 for special needs institutions, and 38,000 for boarding, right? And they've said now that these will be renewed every 3 years. Another one that stands out is that primary school will be called comprehensive school, high school or secondary school will be called senior school. And so there's two demarcations, one to the other. It's going to be very clear. There will also be a one council that coordinates bursaries. So there will be no question about where you're getting assistance from. Is it your member of parliament? Is it the president's fund? Is it one council? And they will be responsible for all of that, which I think is fantastic, but okay. There will also be the decategorization of schools, and that's a big one because national schools, county schools, ex-county schools, sub-county schools, that will be a thing of the past. Everybody essentially on the same playing field. We've also seen that they've suggested or looking at making sure that teachers will go through retraining while on the job for the CBC curriculum. We've also seen that they've suggested that instead of schools will now go towards STEM or other programs. So you go into programs as opposed to now having to fight for marks in an exam.
It's called career paths.
Career paths, yeah, exactly. Going now to higher education, that institutions will now leave the Public Service Commission in terms of recommendation for DVCs and VCs, and university councils now will make those decisions in terms of who those will be. We've also seen that there will be accelerated educational programs for marginalized groups and learners with special needs and adult and it's 14 of them. There's a raft of, but these are some of the ones that stand out today. Yeah. If we start with the decategorization of schools, I would like to hear what your thoughts are about this in terms of how it is going to be implemented, because it's great to say it, but what happens? Will we wake up one morning and we'll be told, all schools up for grabs, go?
Thank you very much. Some clarification, Latif. When the president appointed the Council of Economic Advisors, there was no designation that you will be advising on education, you will be doing this. As the Council of Economic Advisors, we advise the president across all sectors of the economy, and most importantly, the priority areas in his economic transformative agenda. But you realize that in the composition of this council, we have different specialities and the professions. So you'll find cutting across in education, you'll find there is investment climate, you go all through, and a number of things.
I see.
So it has to be very clear that we focus on the president's priorities and deliveries in his plan, the transformative agenda. I happen to be from the academia. Dr. Ndi is academia. We have a professor there who is a professor of law and so forth and so on. So we cut across the various sectors of the economy. Back to the question. We are not going to wake up in the morning and find that the categorization has taken place. The wisdom of the Presidential Working Party was informed that a number of these reforms will have to take place And what you have not accessed maybe is the proposal of the implementation framework and the implementation metrics. In this report, there is an implementation action plan, that there are those that will be implemented. You realize that even when this report has been released, there was an interim report, and the implementation has already taken place, right? And at the final presentation or submission of this report, the Presidential Working Party has provided a very clear time frame for the implementation of the different recommendations that have been put forth. And therefore, one of the considerations that are going to be critical in implementing these particular recommendations, there is a requirement of policy as well as legal and regulatory framework to inform the various recommendations in terms of implementation. So we are not going to wake up in the morning and then find a particular school that was a national school has been categorized along the various career paths. What is going to happen is that there will be, and they have proposed a very clear way, there is a ministerial implementation committee that will be established, and that ministerial implementation committee will interpret the implementation action plan that has been developed, and then do an assessment, look at the various schools, look at their areas of strength, their capacity, and then be able to actualize this within the particular time frames that have been set. Some of the reforms, as I've said, have already been implemented. Others are going to be implemented along the different time frames that have been provided in the implementation plan. And then we are going to see some others waiting for some of the reforms. There are some legal, regulatory, policy frameworks that have to be in place to allow for that particular implementation.
Okay.
And therefore, there is a specific timeline for every recommendation that is to be implemented.
I'm looking at the report.
Yes.
The public schools categorization policies and implementation on access, transition, and costs. The recommendation is discontinue categorization of public secondary schools from the current nomenclature. The activities here would be undertaking an audit to establish the number and distribution of public secondary schools in Kenya.
Exactly.
Generate criteria for classifying schools in terms of career pathways while ensuring all regions have all the options.
Sure.
The responsibility here falls on the Ministry of Education. Timeline, 6 months.
Exactly.
6 months?
Yeah.
Prof? So what should we see after 6 months?
Within the State Department of Basic Education, there is a lot of capacity that is rolled out all the way. And already, these schools are known with regard to what particular areas that they will inform in terms of the career paths.
Okay.
And therefore, the view here is, in terms of assessment, there is the infrastructure already. And in the current system, where you have the National Education Management Information System, the different schools are already in their various current nomenclature.
Yes.
So it is a matter of having to develop that criteria. There has to be that capacity, and if you get to the most resourced state department is the State Department for Basic Education. And it is our belief, and from the Council of Economic Advisors, that the timelines that have been provided here were never brought or were never put on board, having not considered the capacity and having not considered the urgency with which the recommendations have to be implemented.
I can see the possibility, of course, of within a week, the State Department for Basic Education knows the schools that it has across the country.
Exactly.
So the thing of just identifying the schools, does not even require a morning. It's just, how many do we have? We have the numbers. Okay. How many are national schools? How many are extra county, sub-county? We know.
Exactly.
Now, when we now go into career pathways, you could easily say Alliance would go into this career pathway, or any other national school could go into this career pathway. But a majority of our schools, Prof, are sub-county day schools. Now, if a sub-county day school in a certain village is then now given a certain career pathway, what does that mean about the children who would want to take another career pathway in that same village? They have to move to a different village to access a different school. It's a day school.
Okay. As you have read in the recommendations and what the specific activities to be undertaken, part and parcel of the activities to be undertaken is to consider a number of those aspects. And therefore, it will be very clear that within a particular locality, in a particular schools, the State Department will have to develop criteria that will enable the placement of the different students in their career paths. And therefore, just as we have seen in the past, the school where I went, for example, the time I went to that school, it was a mixed boarding and day school, mixed boys and girls. And there was another neighboring school that was the same formation. 1 or 2 years later, after I left the school, my school where I was converted into a girls' school, and the other one was converted into a boys' school.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
And within that framework, therefore, and what you have asked, if students have to move, right? You discover then, where I was, the students who were boys moved out to the neighboring school, and the girls from the other school came to this school that is a girls' school, right? In terms of the career pathways, this is something that happens within the 4 years. The current high schools and second schools, you realize that there's Form 1, Form 2, and then 3, 4.
Yes.
At Form 3 and 4, that's where students start making choices, right?
Yes.
And that is where now that criteria has to apply and place. But in the implementation of, full implementation of the competence-based curriculum, you will find that there is the senior, the junior schools and the senior schools, and therefore it will be possible by way of applying that criteria to locate students in their career pathways, because they have already been asked to provide for that information, and it will be possible. However, in any policy, and this we see as I specialize in strategy, and one of the things is that you have a policy that can be very brilliantly developed, but implementation is where you have issues.
Yes.
And that is what His Excellency the President has been very emphatic, and all of us.
And he says we must.
That implementation has to be clear, and it has to be realized within the time frames. But there is no backtracking.
That is where my issues are.
Yes.
Looking at this entire implementation matrix,
Yes.
most of these changes are to be implemented within 6 months, 1 year, a majority of them. a few others within 2 years, only one to be implemented within 5 years, and some few others to be implemented within 3 years. Let me tell you the one for 5 years, according to this. Supporting technical universities with appropriate infrastructure for SNE programs. That to take 5 years. State Department for TVET and industry, TVET institutions and development partners to be involved in it. The ones for 3 years are also in TVET, universities that were upgraded from TVET to progressively transfer services of academic staff who do not meet the requisite qualifications to each in a university to happen over 3 years. Something else to happen over 3 years, entrenching the Kenya School of TVET in the TVET Act and providing for its regional campuses, strengthening utilization of ODEL in TVET. Those are the things that will take 3 years. Everything else is like 1 year, 2 years, 6 months, 1 year, 2. That's where questions come in. Are we really going to see a transformation of our education sector by 2025, Prof?
Let me say this. When the participation, all of the participants in the presidential working party on education reforms, the different PSs, that is the PS for basic education, the PS for TVET, and the PS for higher education, had representation, and sometimes they will even participate.
Yeah.
When these timelines have been were put forth, there was adequate consultation. And even when these timelines have been proposed, there are those activities that are already ongoing. One of the beautiful things is that some of these recommendations, there are activities that you will find that they will not start from zero. They are already in
advanced stages.
In advanced stages, and therefore, when there was consultation that carrying out some of these recommendations will require this timeline and this timeline, the specific state departments had their input and therefore concurred with that. Now, when you talk about the ideal situation, you will really see that the recommendations put across and the timelines, if resources and the human capital required and the policy reforms and everything that is required is put in place sequentially, you will find this implementation, these timelines realistic. However, on the ground, there is what we called, what is deliberately planned, and that is exactly what we see in the plan. But there could be exigencies and emerging issues. And one of the things that happen is that we have to be flexible to look at the realities on the ground. And what the president has actually asked is that there has to be frequent evaluation, frequent monitoring to update. And if there are any challenges, they are brought and the CS for education is up to the task to ensure that all those timelines are met.
I want to, you mentioned that in terms of implementation, that's where the bottleneck oftentimes is. And if we talk about these 14, they're radical. They are radical changes that are being proposed by the party. The implementation matrix, then of course to be made known, I guess, has already been, is in the report and then will be made known to the parties. For me, I would hope that the angle of implementation would be really scrutinized, because for me, that's the make or break of all of this. I think you can bring about reforms as many as they stand on the seashore. Please do them. But if you can just see from what is happening today with the implementation of CBC, that should be flashing lights in terms of any kind of implementation you want to bring in the future. Right now, even though we know it is a progressive thing, the challenges that we've seen with the implementation of CBC in the country today are huge. Challenges of infrastructure, challenges of teacher training, challenges of books for grade 7, which started grade 7, which was the pioneer class of CBC. Challenges of teachers who don't feel the need to go to these schools and teach. Challenges of where grade 7 will be domiciled. I mean, the list is very long, and these are all factors of implementation. And for me, that is where the attention ought to be. If you're asking yourself, what would the challenge be in implementation? Just look at CBC. CBC is a glaring example of how implementation is a problem. So my question would be, in as much as you want to bring in these new or these reforms, where we are at the moment is a great and glaring example of how implementation is a problem. So how is that going to be handled before we even go to the details?
Okay, thank you very much. One of the things that you have said and you have repeatedly mentioned, the challenges of implementation. In the very early stages of conceptualizing and operationalizing CBC, and the whole spectrum of the issues that arose in the course of implementation, during the president's time of during the elections, there were very clear issues in education that had to be fixed. And given the magnitude of the issues and that arose during the early stages of implementing CBC, it was not something that one will do in a fortnight. And that informed the appointment of the Presidential Working Party. And how have they gone through in developing this report? Three-pronged approach. One, the Presidential Working Party looked at the global best practice. They then looked at the Kenyan situation. They did a very thorough situation analysis to look at the impediments in the implementation and also specifically in the conceptualization of the CPC. And then third, they went around the 47 counties to gather the views from various stakeholders who, some of them are the implementers, the parents, the teachers, and members of the public, right? And having found that there were these challenges of implementing the competence-based curriculum, then went ahead to point out what were those challenges. And as been pointed out in the report, the very clear aspect of the conceptualization as well as the implementation of CPC.
Yeah.
They found very many glaring challenges. And what were those challenges about? The challenges were about on the holistic delivery of the competence-based curriculum. There were aspects of the curriculum that are essentially supposed to be in the competence-based curriculum, but they were not actually part and parcel of the initial stages of implementation. Secondly, they found out that the issues of quality assurance were a major concern. Of course, the domiciling of quality assurance and standards in the Teacher Service Commission and the Ministry of Education, then you find mandate issues and so forth and so on. Third, teacher training, management, and deployment. That was a major challenge. And fourth, the issue of financing and infrastructure development. All those then have been able to be analyzed and incisively synthesized to inform the current reforms so that the competence-based curriculum has its best to deliver. But implementation was found to be a challenge, but most importantly, from the point of conceptualization, initiation, and looking at all that was required to implement a holistic competence-based curriculum. Now, given those challenges, what is the focus in these reforms? And you can see the focus in these reforms is along how do we ensure quality and how do we ensure that the competence-based curriculum is well conceptualized and operationalized in its original and well-meaning form. Third, you then focus on the teachers. And as you've seen for the very first time in history, the government has been able to employ the highest number of teachers, right? And that was one of the key areas, in as much as these teachers then need to go through capacity building and retooling so that they are able to, you remember during the early times, the unions going to the streets telling teachers in order to attend the trainings and so forth and so on. Of course, there were challenges, and those are the ones that you have, the current reforms are focused on. And for sure, I agree that, yes, a brilliant strategy is never, or a policy is never a guarantee for success. Success is realized when it is effectively and successfully implemented. And you then realize results, and those results are the desirable results. And that is what the Presidential Working Party has gone deep to dive into. How was this CPC supposed to have been implemented? And the kind of research that informed these recommendations are fundamental, because if you were to go into the working of the Presidential Working Party, there were different subcommittees. One of the committees that stood out is the Committee on Research, and research on best practice, research on what really happened at the initial stages of implementing the competence-based curriculum. And now when you look at that, you then point out the challenges. And actually these recommendations are meant to address those challenges. But then the question that has been posed is, how sure will we be in terms of ensuring that the challenges that have been witnessed before will not again be the ones that will be dogging the implementation of these particular reforms and these particular recommendations? And that is why it has been very particular. And one thing that is very clear is that the president has been well informed, and having been the one who knew the magnitude of these challenges and appointed the Presidential Working Party, there is commitment. And that commitment is all the way from the president to the CS and to the principal secretaries and all other players in the education sector. So we are going to see how to deal with those challenges of infrastructure. And you see the recommendations on financing. Challenges on quality. You are seeing the recommendations on how the Minister of Education will now have to holistically take up the quality assurance and standards. When it comes to the infrastructure development and all that, then the different other stakeholders are brought on board. And combining the effort from the counties, from the members of parliament and all others to ensure that the capacity of the different schools and institutions in the entire education spectrum are well capacitated. One of the things that is also very fundamental is the human capital, the teacher management, teacher training. And that has been very clear in terms of which institutions are to be responsible to ensure that teachers are given internship, they are also retooled, and they are also capacity built to be able to undertake this particular curriculum.
Prof, many of those challenges, even those ones that have been identified by this working party, appear to have been political challenges. Not necessarily that the professional and education experts who actually came up with the CBC were incompetent, and now we have 43 men and women who have looked at it and noticed the incompetence of the others on this. If it's about infrastructure, infrastructure had been recommended. If we are going to roll out this, we will need infrastructure. Why was there no infrastructure? Political decision, budgetary allocation. If you look at teachers, hire teachers. Why were teachers not hired? Political decision, budgetary allocation. If you look at quality assurance and the overlapping agencies that are running education, TVETA, TSC, I don't know who, University Council, Ministry of Education, political decisions. So many of these challenges are political in nature. How are they going to be addressed?
Latif, I may agree or disagree with you.
Which one do you want it to be?
In terms of political, what do you mean political? And my own understanding and the wider meaning of politics is about interests.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
And interests, in another language, these are stakes.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
And the stakes are held by stakeholders. Right?
Yes.
And during the Presidential Working Party's engagement, that is why they were to engage the political context within which the reforms have to be implemented is a political context. And this political context is where you have these stakes. The stakes from the learners themselves, the stakes from the teachers themselves, the stakes from the political leadership, and the stakes from all other players. So one of the things that you see in that particular report are the views of stakeholders, because you have emphasized that the challenges were political. And that is why a number of stakeholders had to be engaged. A number of stakeholders across the 47 counties had to be engaged, so that if there were any areas where particular stakeholders felt that their issues were not taken into account, they are now brought on board. Right? Secondly, at the very highest political decision making, this is an area where the president has himself taken leadership. So, one, there is what is called political willingness and the political capital. All the stakeholders in the education sector now have to take advantage of the political capital that has been deployed by the head of state in the implementation of these reforms, right? And that is where it starts. How has it been exhibited? The Ministry of Education is the one that has been allocated 30% of the 2023-2024 budget. 630 billion, right? For what reason? To ensure that the president's agenda of making Kenya competitive on its most abundant resource, the human capital, is developed. All the way from the pre-primary to the university.
Prof, as you mentioned the money, I was going to be my next question, because this is not the first time that we've seen education get such a large chunk of the budget.
Great.
Habitually, education gets a lion's share of the budget. And here's a feeling question for you. Do you feel that in the past we've seen the proper absorption of this budget? Do you feel that the amounts allocated to education across board have been properly and efficiently absorbed? And there's a reason why I ask that.
And you have asked about my feeling.
Yes, yes.
Feelings are not necessarily factual things on the ground.
Exactly.
Because you may need to get into the numbers, right? What my feeling could be is that, yes, the Ministry of Education has always received a huge chunk of resource allocation in the budgets. But my feeling will be, in terms of some sectors of the education, the resources must have been used for the purpose for which they were meant, but there could have been pockets of wastage.
Okay.
Pockets of wastage in terms of deployment of those resources.
Okay.
And also, some sectors were deprived of resources, like the higher education was for a long time been deprived of resources. And that is why there has been a crisis.
Early education as well.
Right.
ECD, many could argue as well.
Education is one of those functions that are devolved. ECD is county government, and the lower level vocational trainings are county government functions. And therefore, for purposes of ensuring that the national government and the county governments work together, it is not national government to police
what to do,
to police the counties on how to manage such. And that is why you saw some counties have actually taken on board the ECD teachers on permanent and pensionable
terms. All right. Now, based on what you've said, there could be pockets whereby this efficient absorption did not take place. There could have been wastage, here, lack of priority being applied across board for whatever reason. Now, based on what you said previously now, what guarantees that moving forward there will be efficiency when it comes to the usage of this money that has been allocated from the budget for education? What guarantees that is the president's resolve to make sure that education as a function then is efficient? Is that the guarantee?
There is that guarantee. There is that guarantee, and I can tell you why. For the first time, the president himself will sit in a budget a process where the different state departments will bring all their programs and those that are aligned to the priorities of the current administration, and bit by bit they explain and they demonstrate which specific program, which specific project are the resources going to be deployed for, even when they make this budget. And having had the privilege of sitting in that particular process, the president himself will sit in there for a whole day.
Yes.
Right? And going into granular details, wanting to know how these resources, what is the rationale behind, who is going to be responsible for what, and so forth and so on. So at that point then, And the recent signing of the performance contract, and the president led that exercise, of course, through the Prime Cabinet Secretary. That has been assured, and from the assurances that the resources that have been earmarked for implementing specific programs, specific projects within the various state departments and in the ministries, there have been deliberate efforts to ensure that mechanisms are put in place and they are being led by the specific agencies to ensure that those resources are utilized for the purposes for which they have been allocated. And for sure, there is now a requirement that the budgetary utilization of the resources, there is going to be continuous reporting, right? And from where we sit, we think that can actually fast track.
So it enhances transparency and accountability.
Exactly.
On government projects.
Yes.
On budgetary allocation, utilization, and therefore implementation.
Yeah, sure.
But all that is because the president is one who's asking the questions. The president has too much work.
So we're essentially saying that if the president is not there asking the questions, then we're not really sure if these things will happen.
Does that not then say that the president doesn't trust the people who have been tasked with these duties, that he has to superintend these things in such fine detail?
Line by line.
We have different...
Prof, answer this question after the news, if you don't mind.
Okay.
This is the Situation Room, the only way to start your day.